The great hall of the Winter Palace did not just smell of roasted meat and expensive wine. It smelled of cruelty. It was the year 1348, a night meant for the coronation of a new king. But for one man, it was a public execution of his dignity. As the candlelight flickered against the cold stone walls, the elite of the empire leaned in, their faces twisted with a mockery that felt sharper than any blade. They called him the Shadow Prince, the one they thought was too broken, too silent, and too weak to ever matter. They laughed as he tripped over the heavy silk robes they had forced him to wear, and they toasted to his failure while he stood trembling in the center of the room. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that while they were busy sharpening their tongues, he had already decided how he would sharpen his revenge. They thought they were watching a tragedy of a fool, but they were actually witnessing the birth of a monster that would soon make every laugh in that room turn into a scream of pure, unadulterated regret. This is not just a story of a man who was bullied. It is the true, haunting account of a psychological chess match where the most humiliated person in the room held the strings to everyone's life. Before we dive into the dark corridors of this forgotten history and witness how the laughter died, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this web of betrayal finally untangles. The great hall of the Iron Citadel was a cavern of flickering shadows and suffocating heat, an architectural testament to a dynasty built on blood and gold. On this night, the air was thick with the smell of expensive oils, roasted meats, and the sharp, acidic tang of spilled wine. It was the feast of Saint Lazarus, but the piety of the occasion had long since dissolved into a spectacle of cruelty. At the center of the high table sat Prince Julian, the younger son of a dying empire, a man whose very existence seemed to be an apology for his lack of stature and strength, while his older brother, General Marcus, sat like a bronze statue draped in medals. Julian was a pale ghost in silk. He was a scholar in a court that only respected the sword, a thinker in a room full of executioners. The nobility, sensing the impending death of the old king, had chosen their side. They didn't just ignore Julian, they hunted him with their tongues. Count Valerius, a man whose charisma was as vast as his corruption, stood up. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson from the heavy Malvasia wine. He didn't offer a toast to the kingdom. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Julian, a predatory glint in his eyes. With a theatrical flourish, Valerius called for a gift for the prince who spent more time with dusty parchments than with the ladies of the court. Two servants entered, carrying a heavy, rusted iron crown, crudely forged and topped with a donkey's ears. The room fell into a jagged silence before exploding into a roar of laughter that shook the very tapestries on the walls. Julian didn't move. He sat perfectly still as Valerius forced the cold, jagged metal onto his head, the sharp edges drawing a thin line of blood across his forehead. The elite of the empire, dukes, barons, and even the high clergy, leaned forward, their faces twisted in a grotesque mirth, throwing scraps of bread and dregs of wine at the man who was legally their superior. To them, Julian was a broken thing, a soft soul meant to be crushed. They mocked his stutter. They joked about his fragile mind, and they openly discussed how Marcus would likely have him exiled to a monastery the moment the king's heart stopped beating. Julian's eyes, however, were not filled with tears. They were fixed on the flickering candles, wide and unblinking, recording every face, every laugh, and every hand that reached out to pull at his robe. He felt the cold trickle of blood reach his eyebrow, a warm contrast to the icy resolve hardening in his chest. For years, he had been the invisible observer, the one who took the minutes of the council meetings while they discussed wars he knew they would lose, and taxes they knew the peasants couldn't pay. He knew which of these men were selling secrets to the northern invaders, and which of these women were poisoning their husbands for inheritance. He was the vault of the kingdom's darkest secrets, and tonight the vault had been pried open by their own arrogance. As the night deepened, the cruelty became more organized. They forced Julian to stand on the table and recite poetry, tripping him as he tried to navigate the grease-slicked wood. They treated him like a court jester, a common fool whose only purpose was to provide a momentary distraction from the rot consuming their borders. Marcus, his own flesh and blood, watched with a smirk of detached boredom, occasionally nodding as Valerius delivered another stinging insult. The betrayal was absolute. There was no sanctuary in this room, no loyalty, only the raw, naked exercise of power over the powerless. Julian looked out over the sea of laughing faces and realized that these were not leaders. They were vultures waiting for a carcass. And in that moment, the prince who had spent his life trying to earn their love finally understood that fear was a far more stable currency. Suddenly, the massive oak doors of the great hall were slammed shut, the heavy iron bolts sliding home with a finality that silenced the room. The laughter died in a sudden, jagged gasp. The nobility looked toward the doors, then back to the high table, confused. Julian, still wearing the rusted donkey crown, slowly stepped down from the table. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He wiped the blood from his brow with a silk handkerchief and turned to look at the grand clock on the wall. It was precisely midnight. The air in the room seemed to grow thin, and a strange, metallic smell began to waft from the ventilation grates beneath the floor, a smell Julian had spent months perfecting in his private laboratory. He looked at Count Valerius, who was now swaying slightly, his hand clutching his throat as if he couldn't quite catch his breath. Julian's voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer a stutter. It was a low, melodic whisper that carried to every corner of the silent hall. He told them that he had always admired their appetite for celebration, but he feared they had indulged in something far more permanent than wine tonight. He revealed that the special vintage served only to the nobility this evening was a masterpiece of alchemy, a slow-acting neuroparalytic agent that would not kill them, but would strip them of their will, leaving them perfectly conscious, but unable to move a single muscle. As the first of the dukes collapsed silently into his plate of half-eaten venison, Julian leaned in close to Valerius and whispered the most terrifying truth of all. The northern invaders weren't at the borders. They were already in the courtyard, and he was the one who had given them the keys. The silence that followed Julian's confession was more deafening than the laughter that had preceded it. It was a thick, visceral silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud of wine cups hitting the floor as fingers lost their grip. One by one, the titans of the empire, the men who decided the fates of thousands, slumped in their gilded chairs, Their eyes remained wide, darting frantically, trapped in bodies that had become their own prisons. Count Valerius sat upright, his jaw frozen in a half-open snarl of confusion, while a single, pathetic bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Julian walked slowly around the table, the iron donkey crown still perched on his head like a satirical halo. He looked into their eyes, searching for the arrogance that had been there only minutes ago, but he found only a raw, animal terror. Julian stopped behind his brother, Marcus. The great general, the hero of 100 battles, was now nothing more than a statue of meat and muscle. Julian leaned down, his lips inches from Marcus's ear, and whispered about the nights he had spent in the library while Marcus was out hunting. He explained that while Marcus was studying the art of the frontal assault, Julian was studying the chemistry of the mind and the logistics of the shadows. He told Marcus that the northern invaders he had mentioned weren't the barbarians they feared. They were the very soldiers Marcus had discarded, the veterans left to rot without pay, and the peasants whose lands had been seized to fund this very feast. Julian hadn't betrayed the kingdom to an enemy. He had returned it to the people Marcus and his peers had forgotten. The heavy bolts on the doors groaned and finally gave way. But instead of a foreign army, the hall was filled with the common guard and the city's poorest citizens, led by officers who had long since sworn a secret oath to the Shadow Prince. They didn't come in with torches and blades to slaughter. They came with chains and ledgers. They began to systematically strip the nobility of their rings, their seals of office, and their dignity. The high priest, who had laughed the loudest at Julian's clumsiness, felt his heavy gold cross ripped from his neck. He tried to protest, but his vocal cords were paralyzed, leaving him to make a sound like a dying bird. This was the true psychological torture, to be conscious as your world is dismantled piece by piece, to be alive as your legacy is erased. Julian walked back to the center of the hall and finally removed the rusted iron crown. He didn't throw it away. He placed it gently on the table in front of Count Valerius. He then signaled for the servants, the same ones who had been forced to help humiliate him, to bring in the families of the noblemen. Wives, daughters, and sons were ushered into the hall. When they saw their husbands and fathers sitting like corpses, frozen in positions of mockery, the room finally broke. The wives fell to their knees, their wails echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The children clung to the paralyzed legs of their fathers, begging them to wake up, to speak, to do something. The very people who had looked down on the world from their high towers were now watching their loved ones suffer in a tragedy they had written with their own cruelty. As the paralytic began to wear off just enough for the nobility to regain control of their tear ducts, the crying began. It wasn't just the families. The noblemen themselves began to weep. They weren't crying for the prince they had bullied, nor were they crying for the kingdom they had ruined. They were crying for themselves. They realized that Julian wasn't going to kill them. Death would have been a mercy, a quick end to their shame. Instead, he was going to let them live as paupers in the very streets they had neglected. He was going to make them watch as he rebuilt the empire using the intellect they had called weakness. The sight of the once mighty Count Valerius, tears streaming down his face, unable to even wipe his own nose, while the peasants he once kicked now stood over him in judgment, was the ultimate reversal of power. Julian stood at the head of the hall, no longer the victim, no longer the jester. He watched the sea of weeping elites and felt no joy, only a profound, heavy sense of justice. He had shown them that the mind is a far more dangerous weapon than the sword, and that the person you mock today might be the one who holds your heartbeat in his hand tomorrow. By the time the sun began to rise over the Winter Palace, the celebration was over. The old regime was in chains, and the man they called a fool was the only one left standing with a clear vision of the future. The laughter had ended hours ago, replaced by a haunting chorus of sobs that would ring in the halls of history for centuries to come. This story serves as a chilling reminder that the way we treat those we perceive as lesser defines our own destiny. Arrogance is a blindfold that prevents us from seeing the storm until it is too late. In the end, true power doesn't lie in the ability to humiliate others, but in the patience to endure, the wisdom to observe, and the strength to turn your scars into a map for change. Never mistake silence for weakness, for the quietest person in the room is often the one plotting the loudest revolution. If this journey into the darker side of history moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We bring you the hidden stories of the past that prove truth is often more intense than any fiction. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the human psyche.